3:17 p.m., September 14, 1945. The afternoon rain hammered the converted manor house in Somerset like machine gun fire, relentless, cold, unforgiving. 32 German women pressed themselves against the drawing room wall so hard their shoulder blades ached against the stone. Outside, gravel had turned to mud. Inside, terror had calcified into silence. They were nurses, signals operators, clerks who'd been typing requisition orders when the Western Front collapsed like a house of cards. They'd survived the chaos of retreat, bombed roads, screaming refugees, the smell of burning cities that clung to their uniforms like a second skin. They'd endured the lorry ride from Dover, bouncing through English countryside so impossibly green it seemed obscene after the grey wasteland Germany had become. But none of that prepared them for what came next. 3 knocks, sharp, measured, official. The kind of knock that preceded interrogations, beatings, worse. A woman screamed, a high animal sound that ricocheted off the vaulted ceiling. Others grabbed each other, nails drawing blood from palms. One nurse, 24 years old, her field hospital insignia faded to ghosts, dropped to her knees and began praying in rapid German, words tumbling over each other in desperation. They knew what capture meant. They'd been told, repeatedly, brutally, Allied soldiers would strip them, starve them, parade them through streets while crowds spat and threw stones. Reprisal for crimes committed in Germany's name. Whether they'd committed them or not didn't matter. The Gestapo had been explicit. Capture was dishonor. Survival in enemy hands was betrayal. The door opened. 2 British soldiers entered. They were holding tea trays, real china cups, steam rising in delicate wisps, a plate of biscuits arranged with care that seemed impossible, absurd, dangerous in its normalcy. The lance corporal, young with a Somerset accent thick as cream, set his tray down and spoke words that made no sense. "Thought you might want something warm. It's cold in here." The silence that followed was more complete than the screaming. Then someone began to cry. Not the harsh sobs of terror, but something softer, more broken. The sound spread through the room like water through cracked stone, slow, inevitable, unstoppable. The lance corporal backed toward the door, flustered. His companion muttered something about fetching milk and fled. The women stood paralyzed, staring at the tea as though it might vanish or transform into poison. They couldn't reconcile this tenderness with everything they'd been taught to expect. Finally, one woman moved. Greta was her name. She stepped forward on legs that trembled, lifted a cup with hands that shook so badly the china rattled, and brought it to her lips. Sweetness, warmth, and something else. The bitter, terrifying comfort of certainty collapsing. The war was over. Their side had lost, and their captors had just offered them tea. They had been prepared for every form of suffering except kindness. For months before capture, propaganda had painted their future in blood. Radio broadcasts described British prison camps as charnel houses, women stripped and humiliated, starved in cellars, worked to death in quarries until their hands bled and their backs broke. The images were specific, deliberate, designed to burrow into the mind and build a bunker there. These women had believed it, not because they were fanatics, though a few were, but because fear makes believers of us all. They'd seen British bombers turn German cities into moonscapes. They'd pulled children from rubble, bodies small enough to cradle in one arm. It was easy to imagine that men who dropped those bombs would show no mercy when their enemies finally stood before them defenseless. So when the lorries pulled into Somerset and guards opened the doors, many had braced for violence. Instead, they were handed identification cards printed in German, told their belongings would be catalogued and returned, led to quarters that, while sparse, were clean, heated, and fitted with proper beds. It made no sense. The confusion deepened when a British medical officer conducted examinations with brisk efficiency and no trace of cruelty. She was in her 40s, greying hair pinned beneath a cap, asking questions in halting German. She checked for lice and illness, noted injuries in a ledger without comment. When one prisoner flinched at the touch of a stethoscope, the doctor paused, met her eyes and said quietly, "You're safe here." The prisoner didn't believe her, not yet. But the words lodged somewhere beneath the fear, small and insistent as a splinter. What these women couldn't yet see was the machinery behind their treatment. Britain's handling of prisoners wasn't spontaneous compassion but policy, deliberate, systematic, designed to serve objectives that transcended sentiment. Security first. A well-treated prisoner was less likely to attempt escape, less likely to incite unrest, more likely to comply with regulations. Brutality bred desperation. Decency bred order. Intelligence second. Prisoners who felt secure were more willing to talk, not under duress, but in casual conversation, in letters home that could be read, in the slow erosion of loyalty that came when the enemy proved more humane than one's own leaders. Reciprocity third. British soldiers were held in German camps. Treatment on both sides was watched, measured, reported. The Geneva Convention wasn't just a document, but a lever ensuring mercy flowed in both directions. Morality fourth. Not sentimentality, but the cold calculation that a nation's character was revealed in how it treated the powerless. Britain had been bombed, bled by years of war, threatened with invasion. Yet its leadership understood that vengeance would corrode the very civilization they claimed to defend. The results were measurable. By 1945, Britain held over 400,000 German prisoners. Red Cross inspections found mortality rates far lower than in civilian populations back in Germany. Calorie counts met or exceeded Geneva standards. Work details were monitored. Abuses, when they occurred, were investigated. Restraint wasn't weakness. It was policy enforced with the same rigor as military discipline. The women arriving in Somerset weren't anomalies. They were part of a system that had decided years earlier that civilization's strength lay not in the capacity for cruelty, but in the refusal to indulge it. The first days passed in a haze of disbelief. Processing was methodical. Each woman was photographed, fingerprinted, assigned a number. Personal effects were inventoried, not confiscated. Wedding rings, photographs, even small religious items were returned after inspection. Rules were posted in German on the barrack walls. Curfews, work assignments, consequences for infractions. But the consequences listed were measured. Loss of privileges, confinement to quarters, not beatings, not starvation. Then came the first meal. It was served in a dining hall that had once been the manor's ballroom, now fitted with long trestle tables and benches. The women filed in silently, expecting thin gruel or stale bread. What they received instead shattered their understanding of captivity. Stew thick with vegetables and mutton, fresh bread, real butter, pale yellow and soft. No one moved. The guards standing by the door exchanged glances. One stepped forward, ladled a portion onto his own plate, ate a spoonful, and nodded. "It's the same as ours," he said in broken German. "Eat slowly." Forks lifted. The first bites were cautious, disbelieving. Then hunger took over. Some ate methodically, savoring each mouthful as though it might be their last. Others wept into their plates, shoulders shaking with sobs they couldn't control. A few couldn't eat at all, overwhelmed by the impossibility of it. Greta sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the bowl in front of her as though it were a trap. A British nurse, stationed in the hall, crouched beside her. "Are you ill?" she asked gently. Greta shook her head. "I cannot," she whispered. "My children, they have nothing." The nurse said nothing for a long moment. Then she reached out and placed her hand over Greta's, warm and solid. "You must eat," she said. "You cannot help them if you waste away here." It was logic, not sentiment, but it broke through. Greta lifted the spoon and ate, tears streaming because the nurse was right, and because the food was real, and because somewhere in Germany her children were hungry, and she was not. Within a week, the women were assigned to work details, not hard labor, not punishment, but tasks designed to keep them occupied and contribute to the local economy, which was desperate for hands after years of conscription. Some were sent to nearby farms to assist with the late harvest. Others worked in the manor's kitchens or laundry. A few with nursing training were brought to the local hospital to assist with civilian patients under supervision. The work wasn't trivial. Hours were long and the tasks demanding, but they were fair. Breaks were scheduled. Extra rations were provided for physical labor, and most remarkably, the women were paid, small sums in camp currency that could be used for toiletries, cigarettes, or postage. It was on the farms that the deeper transformation began. Greta and 5 others were assigned to a dairy farm 3 miles from the camp. Each morning a guard drove them in a lorry, but within days the guard remained at the gate while the women walked unescorted to the milking sheds. The farmer was in his 60s, his sons fighting overseas. He watched them work with quiet approval. When they finished early one afternoon, he gestured for them to sit on hay bales and produced a thermos of tea and a tin of biscuits. "You're good workers," he said in English, which one of the women translated haltingly. "Better than some I've hired." Greta, surprised, asked why he trusted them. The farmer shrugged. "War's over. You're here. Might as well treat you decent." He paused, then added quietly, "My boy's in a camp in Germany. I hope someone's giving him tea." The logic was simple but devastating. He wasn't kind because he liked them. He was kind because he understood that mercy was reciprocal, that treating prisoners well might mean his son received the same. The women worked harder after that, not out of fear, but out of something closer to respect. When the farmer offered them Sunday dinner at his table, roast chicken, potatoes, carrots, they sat stiffly, unused to the gesture. His wife served them the same portions she gave her husband. When one woman thanked her in broken English, the wife smiled and said, "You're welcome, dear." It was ordinary, and it shattered them. For those with nursing training, the most profound encounters came in the local hospital. British doctors, stretched thin by wartime shortages, accepted German nurses into their wards with little ceremony. The work was familiar, changing dressings, monitoring patients, assisting with surgeries. But the environment was revolutionary. Medicines that had vanished from German hospitals years ago were here in abundance. Penicillin, still almost mythical in the Reich, was used routinely. X-ray machines hummed daily. Surgical instruments gleamed, sterilized, and plentiful. One nurse, a woman named Elsa who had worked in a field hospital near the Ruhr, stood frozen before a cabinet stocked with sulfur drugs, morphine, and bandages. "We lost men for lack of one of these," she whispered to another nurse. "Boys bled out because we had nothing to give them." Her companion, a British sister, overheard. "I know," she said quietly. "War is waste." There was no triumph in her voice, no gloating, just the exhausted acknowledgement of a truth both women understood. Elsa nodded, throat tight, and returned to her work. The patients too were a revelation. British civilians, some injured in bombings, treated the German nurses with weary politeness that gradually warmed into casual conversation. One elderly man recovering from a broken hip asked Elsa where she was from. "Essen," she said. He nodded thoughtfully. "Lovely city. Visited before the war. Cathedral was beautiful." Elsa stared at him. "You remember it?" "Of course." He smiled faintly. "War doesn't change that. Places, people, they matter more than governments." It was a small moment, but it lodged deep. He didn't see her as an enemy. He saw her as a person from a place he had once admired, and in that recognition, the distance between them collapsed. Months passed. Autumn turned to winter, and the women adjusted to rhythms that felt less like captivity and more like exile. The barbed wire remained. The guards still watched, but restrictions loosened. Women who had proven reliable were allowed to walk the manor grounds unescorted. A small library was opened, stocked with books in German and English. On Sundays, a chaplain conducted services for those who wished to attend, Catholic and Protestant alike. Christmas arrived, and with it an event that would be remembered for decades. The local church, a stone building with a Norman tower, invited the prisoners to attend midnight mass. The invitation was optional. No one would be forced, but when the evening came, nearly all the women chose to go. They walked through the village in a quiet column, flanked by guards who carried no weapons, only torches to light the way. Inside the church, villagers filled the pews. Some glanced at the prisoners with curiosity, a few with suspicion, but most simply made room, shifting along wooden benches to allow the women to sit. The service was in English, but the hymns were familiar. Silent Night rose from the congregation, and the German women, hesitant at first, joined in their own language. Two versions of the same song filled the vaulted space, weaving together into something that transcended the barriers between them. When the service ended, the vicar stood at the door, shaking hands. When Greta passed, he pressed a small parcel into her hands, biscuits wrapped in brown paper. "Merry Christmas," he said simply. She didn't trust herself to speak. She nodded and held the parcel against her chest as she walked back through the cold night. Later, in the barracks, the women opened parcels sent by local families: socks, soap, chocolate, cards drawn by school children. One card, decorated with a crayon star, read in careful script, "To the German ladies, we hope you go home soon." Greta pinned it above her bed and stared at it until the candles burned low. By early 1946, the women were no longer the same people who had screamed at the sound of a knock. They had learned English phrases. They knew the names of the guards, the farmers, the nurses they worked beside. They had tasted abundance, not as prisoners, but as participants in a society that, despite the devastation of war, had not abandoned its principles. But the deepest change was internal. One evening, as Greta sat mending a shirt by lamplight, another woman, a signals operator named Anna, asked the question they had all been avoiding. "If they lied about this," Anna said quietly, "what else did they lie about?" The room fell silent. It was the question that unraveled everything. If the British weren't the monsters they'd been told, if abundance existed where they'd been promised only weakness, if mercy was policy rather than propaganda, then what of the Reich's other claims? What of the Führer's promises? What of the war itself? Greta set down her needle. "Everything," she said. It wasn't a conclusion, it was a confession. In the spring of 1947, the orders came. The women would be sent home. Repatriation had been delayed by the chaos of post-war Europe, but now the transports were ready. They would return to a Germany divided, occupied, still reeling from destruction. The news was met with tears, not of joy, though some wept for that too, but of sorrow. They were leaving behind a place that had, against all logic, become a refuge. They had worked on farms they had come to respect. They had walked through villages where people nodded to them in passing. They had been treated not as enemies, but as human beings. On the final morning, the lorries arrived to take them to the port. The women gathered their few belongings: clothes, letters, small gifts received over the months. Greta folded the Christmas card carefully and placed it in her pocket. As they climbed into the lorries, the farmer who had employed Greta appeared at the gate. He handed her a small cloth bundle. Inside was a loaf of bread, still warm, and a jar of honey. "For the journey," he said. Greta tried to thank him, but the words caught in her throat. He nodded, understanding, and stepped back. The lorries rolled through the village one last time. A few locals paused to watch them pass. One elderly woman raised her hand in farewell. A child waved. The gestures were small, but they mattered. The return to Germany was brutal. Many women arrived to find their homes destroyed, their families scattered or dead. The cities were rubble. Food was scarce. The contrast between the life they had just left and the reality they returned to was almost unbearable. But they carried something with them. Not just memories, but a template for what was possible. A society that fed even its enemies. A culture that valued restraint over revenge. A system that understood mercy wasn't weakness, but strength. Some women wrote letters to the families who had sent them Christmas parcels. A few maintained correspondence for decades. One woman, years later, returned to Somerset as a guest of the farmer who had given her tea. She stood in the same milking shed where she had worked, now older and freer, and said quietly, "You saved more than my life. You saved my belief that people can be good." True strength isn't the capacity to inflict suffering, but the discipline to refuse it. The women who screamed when British guards knocked and cried when they brought good food learned this lesson in the most unexpected classroom: captivity. They had been taught that their enemies were weak, decadent, unworthy. Instead, they found a society confident enough to show mercy, organized enough to enforce decency, and civilized enough to remember that prisoners were still people. The war was won not only on battlefields, but in moments like these, when soldiers carried tea trays instead of weapons, when farmers shared Sunday dinners, when nurses used precious medicines on those who had once been enemies. Decades later, when some of those women returned to England, they stood before the manor in Somerset, now converted back to private use. The barbed wire was gone, the guard towers had been dismantled, but the memory remained. One woman, her hair white and her hands gnarled with age, placed her palm against the cold stone wall and said softly, "This is where I learned what civilization means." Her companion nodded. They stood in silence for a long moment, then turned and walked back down the gravel path, their footsteps crunching in the same rhythm as they had 50 years before. Behind them, smoke rose from a chimney. Inside, a kettle was boiling. Mercy given freely doesn't diminish the giver. It reveals them.